Welcome everyone to the post-election roundup webinar brought to you by the Transportation Energy Partners. My name is Phillip Wiedmeyer. I am chairman and president of the Alabama Clean Fuels Coalition, and I'm vice president of Transportation Energy Partners, or as we affectionately call it, TEP. And TEP is a independent national nonprofit organization that provides policy support for the nation's Clean Cities coalitions and their stakeholders. TEP is not affiliated with the U.S. Department of Energy. Our mission is to keep coalitions and stakeholders informed of key policies and programs and to educate key decision makers about the importance of advancing markets for clean vehicles and fuels. Today, the agenda for the webinar will have a brief overview of the 2012 election results by Ken Brown, who is our DC consultant for TEP. And then the panel discussion will include our panelists today are Genevieve Cullen from the Electric Drive Transportation Association, Paul Kerkhoven from Natural Gas Vehicles for America, Phil Square with the National Propane Gas Association, and Dan Weiss with the Center for American Progress. Following the discussion, we'll open the webinar up for questions from those of you who are participating with us today. Next slide. And there's our panelist. Now, a little bit about TEP. As I said, we provide policy support for our Clean Cities coalitions. Next slide. And one of our current activities is to host an annual Energy Independence Summit. We did it in March of this year, and we're currently in the early planning stages for our Energy Independence Summit for 2013, which I want to encourage all of you to save the date, which will be April 7th through 10th. The summit we had this past March was our best one ever. We had more than 150 participants, including Clean City Coalition leaders, their stakeholders, and national leaders in the clean transportation industry. Our speakers included Connecticut Governor Dannel Malloy, White House CEQ Chair Nancy Sutley, Congressman Steve Israel, and others. We had excellent speakers and panelists, and we organized more than 107 individual meetings on Capitol Hill where we educated members of Congress about how Clean Cities coalitions and our partners are implementing alternative fuel projects across the country and is leading to significant reductions in our dependence on foreign oil. Our sponsors included of the conference included leaders in the electric, natural gas, propane, and biofuels industry. So please mark your calendar for that. Next, I want to introduce Ken Brown, who will be moderating today's webinar. As I mentioned, he's our Washington, D.C. consultant, and he's based in D.C., where he has more than 25 years of experience working on energy and environmental issues at the federal, state, and local levels. Ken?
Thanks, Philip, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. I'm going to give a brief overview of the election results, which most of you probably already know, and then we're going to bring on our panel of Washington, D.C. experts who are working with the federal agencies in the administration and members of Congress and their staff on a day-to-day basis to give you guys insight in what's happening right now in Washington and what the prospects are for clean energy and clean transportation policy in the months and years ahead. So, as everybody knows, I'm sure this map looks very familiar to you with the red states and the blue states from our recent presidential election. I think the bottom line, as everybody knows, is that President Obama won re-election, and he won by a reasonably handy margin, at least compared to recent elections in the past years. He had 332 electoral votes. And then on the popular vote margin, it ended up being about 51% for President Obama and 47% for Governor Romney. In terms of the House and the Senate, the Democrats gained 2 seats in the Senate, and they retained control of the Senate by a margin of 55 to 45 when you include the 2 independent members, one from Vermont and one from Maine, who are caucusing with the Democrats. And on the House side, the Republicans maintain a sizable majority of 234 to 201, but the Democrats did gain 8 seats in the House during the recent election. One thing I wanted to point out is that there have been some recent polling on the public's views on clean energy and climate change. And one thing is that the public support remains very strong, particularly for promoting clean energy and moving us away from petroleum-based fuels. And you can see here the levels have been fairly consistent, and that currently about 92% of the public believe that developing clean energy sources should be either a medium or a very high or very high priority. Another interesting thing that's developed, at least in terms of public opinion over the past few years, is that for a long time there was very consistent bipartisan support for clean energy and alternative energy sources. The bipartisan support remains strong. However, we have seen over the past 4 years somewhat of a drop-off in Republican support for clean energy. So I just wanted to point that out. I think it's something that we're going to talk about with the panel in our discussion. Just very briefly, I can hear if the other panelists could please put your phones in mute right now. I hear a little typing and background noise, so I would appreciate that. There have been a few changes. There will be a few changes in leadership positions with respect to energy policy in both the House and the Senate. You can see on this slide the key players. They include, obviously, Speaker of the House John Boehner, the Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Chairman of the House Energy Committee Fred Upton from Michigan, Henry Waxman is the ranking member for the House Energy Committee, the Tax Writing Committee, which is called the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp from Michigan is the chairman, Sander Levin, also from Michigan, is the ranking member, the Democratic leader on the committee. The House Appropriations, Energy and Water Subcommittee, we have Rodney Frelinghuysen from New Jersey as the chair, and Peter Visklosky, the ranking member for Energy and Water. Now, not all of these decisions are final, but these are the likely folks in most of these positions. And then we have a new House leader on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Bill Schuster from Pennsylvania will be the new chairman of this committee, and Nick Rahal from West Virginia will continue to be the ranking member. Next slide, please. And then on the Senate side, the most notable change, and we'll talk about a little bit about this with our panel, Ron Wyden from Oregon will be the new chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. And then the other likely change is that David Vitter from Louisiana will be the lead Republican on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Next slide, please. In terms of key administration officials on climate and energy policy, you can see the key players here. I think of note is that it has been rumored that Energy Secretary Stephen Chu and EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson may leave the administration in the next few months, and so obviously if they do depart, we will have new leadership in 2 critical positions. It appears that Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood will be staying on at least for the next couple of years with the administration. Finally, I want to point out the top legislative and policy priorities for transportation energy partners, and these have been fairly consistent over time. Just very briefly, obviously, tax incentives for alternative fuels, vehicles, and infrastructure are very important to the industry. Maintaining federal funding for the Department of Energy Clean Cities program, for research and development on alternative fuels and vehicles are very important. Funding for EPA programs such as the diesel emission reduction grants are a high priority. Department of Transportation funding for the CMAQ program and for alternative fuels for buses are very important. And then also Department of Agricultural programs for alternative fuels. Finally, there's likely to be an attack on the renewable fuels standard, and so that's going to be important to defend. And even though we finally were able to see a federal transportation law reauthorized last summer, it was only a 2-year reauthorization, so that legislation will be under discussion very shortly in terms of reauthorization. So those are top priorities. And again, our panelists who are joining us today include Phil Square from the National Propane and Gas Association, Paul Kerkhoven from the Natural Gas Vehicles for America, Genevieve Cullen, Electric Drive Transportation Association, and Dan Weiss with the Center for American Progress. So thanks very much to our panelists for joining us. And I'm now going to pose a few questions to the panelists. I would like to also point out that if any members of the audience have questions, you can just enter your questions on the question box on the side of your screen, and we'll have those questions, and we will pose your questions to the panelists as well. I want to start with a question for Genevieve Cullen with the Electric Drive Transportation Association. Genevieve, thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate it. The question is, now that the election is over, what, if anything, has changed, and what are the prospects for favorable action on clean transportation policy in the months and years ahead?
Oh, months and years ahead. It's a big question, but thank you, and thanks for having me on the call. And I think I would begin by saying that although control of the House and the Senate and the White House stayed the same, I think there are different dynamics that will be in play in the coming Congress. On the favorable side for action on alternative fuel issues, I think the White House and our champions see the president's reelection as an affirmation of a clean energy agenda. It was very much part of the campaign, and I know that the White House is very motivated and committed to advancing its agenda in this next Congress. What is also different, however, on potentially the negative side is that whatever agreement that they may or may not reach on fiscal cliff issues and further down the road on the shape of tax reform, that's going to limit resource and policy options. I think even with established champions still in place on appropriations, on finance and ways and means, we will have to work very hard to justify program and tax spending. I feel confident we can all make the case about the competitiveness benefits as well as the environmental benefits of the alternative fuels agenda, but I think nothing, everything is going to be on the table in the coming Congress, and that we're going to have to make ourselves be visible and make our case.
Great. Thanks, Genevieve. Next question I'm going to give to Paul Kerkhoven for the Natural Gas Vehicles for America. Paul, you know, traditionally and historically there's been very broad bipartisan support for alternative fuels and vehicles across the board, and that has somewhat eroded during the past several years. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on what are the opportunities to restore and rebuild that bipartisan support.
Thank you very much for having me on the call, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think in terms of the support, for, like Genevieve was saying, you know, it's going to be a tough battle. Tax reform is on the forefront. Activities in terms of supporting natural gas or propane or electric vehicle tax credits, all are going to be looked at with are going to be put under a microscope. And people are going to have to look and say, hey, you know, can we justify this? Can we go forward for all of these? That said, there's always support for programs like these, for these tax incentives, and for people to work together. It's unfortunate that some of the members in Congress at the present time, you know, they don't talk, or some of the collaboration that existed in previous years isn't there. But I think people in the long run realize that we need to move forward. There are certain activities that need some federal support, that need that push, and I think we can go forward on that. I'm optimistic we can move forward in those type of programs and activities.
Building on that, this is for Phil Square with the National Propane Gas Association. One of the things that we found when we were in D.C. for the Energy Independence Summit last spring, and we were making a big push along with others in the industry to get the current tax incentives that have expired extended. And, you know, we were meeting with a number of key Republican leaders on these issues. And in the meeting they said, you know, look, we're really with you on this stuff, and we're supportive, but we're in an election year and it's tough for us to be out front on these items. Do you think that's likely to change somewhat in the months ahead, or and any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Ken. I do think it's going to change a little bit. Even after my years in Washington, I try to maintain a sense of optimism about the ability of members of Congress on the House and the Senate, on the left and the right, to understand that there are things that they can do for the country to achieve the national goals. And I think some of the national goals are coming more and more, or becoming less and less abstract, like energy independence and security. And I think one of the things that we've found in our meetings up on the Hill is that resonates with everyone, really. What you have here is a group of alternative fuels and energy sources that can achieve goals for the country, whether they're environmental or economic or jobs or security or all those types of things. And we all pull in the same direction. I think it increases the likelihood that we will be taken as a group of alternatives to the old-fashioned fuels that we're using now. And so that's one of the main points that we've been able to make, is that as long as you maintain parity among all these fuels and that one isn't chosen over the other, and you can maintain your unity as a family of alternative energies, the likelihood of action will be dramatically improved. And so that's really job one for the propane industry, is to work with our friends. We may not even be competitors, but then again we may be, but at the same time I think everyone benefits if Congress moves its policy forward and extends the tax credits that have made a difference in where we are now with alternative fuels.
Great. Thanks, Phil. And this question is for Dan Weiss with the Center for American Progress. Dan, thanks for being with us today. Obviously, we're going to see a few changes in congressional leadership, and we may see some changes in the administration leadership, particularly with respect to Congress. We're going to have a new chairman of the Senate Energy Committee, Ron Wyden from Oregon, who's going to replace Jeff Bingaman, who's been in that position for a long, long time. You know, how is Mr. Wyden's chairmanship likely to impact clean energy policy, and what do you see happening both in the House and Senate with key leaders moving forward?
Well, first, Ken, thanks for having me, and I want to make sure you can hear me because I want to make sure I hit all the right buttons.
We can hear you.
Great.
Sounds
okay.
good.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining. Well, looking into my crystal ball in my office, which you can't see because it's a webinar, I can see a couple things. First, Senator Wyden is the first chair of the Senate Energy Committee who does not come from a natural gas producing state in about 15 or 16 years. And in fact, Senator Wyden from Oregon, who has a strong record on clean air related issues, which obviously alternatively fueled vehicles have many benefits there. He's big on energy independence, but he is not very interested in high natural gas prices for natural gas producers. And so, for example, he has raised a lot of very poignant questions about the efficacy and the impact of exporting liquefied natural gas, which the natural gas producers want to do, which will raise the price of natural gas for domestic users. In talking with Paul Kerkhoven, and I'll let Paul respond to this in a minute, he suggested that won't have much of a difference in actually the price of using CNG as an alternative fuel, but nonetheless, if Wyden gets his way, then it may be much tougher to export natural gas. One other thing Senator Wyden is noted for, as was Senator Bingaman, is reaching across the aisle and working out deals with Republicans. The Senate Energy Committee is one of the more functional Senate committees in that they can still work together to pass legislation on a bipartisan basis. So in the past couple of years, they've passed in the 111th Congress, they passed bipartisan energy legislation. Even last Congress, they passed the Portman-Shaheen energy efficiency bill. And so I would look for a lot of comprehensive agreements between Senator Wyden and Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, the ranking Republican member of the Energy Committee. However, getting any such legislation to the floor of the Senate is going to be very difficult because even though they could probably pass the measure itself, it will become a magnet for other ideas from one side or the other that are very partisan in nature, which means it'll be very difficult to have a debate just on whatever they can get passed through the Senate Energy Committee. The other change you might want to be aware of, and you all would know whether or not this has much impact on you, is that the new ranking Republican member of the Senate Commerce Committee is going to be Republican Senator John Thune of South Dakota. He's been a big supporter of wind energy in the past. He's been a supporter of biofuels. And so how that comes into play with your industry remains to be seen, but he starts out, I think, from a somewhat of a friendly perspective. The biggest challenge in passing legislation that will help move the prospects of alternative fuel vehicles forward is that in the House you have essentially the same Republican leadership leading all the committees, and in fact they are hostile to doing anything that would harm or otherwise impinge on the market of oil industry. And so I would be very surprised if they moved any alternative fuel or clean energy legislation through the House. If so, I think it's more likely to come through the House Ways and Means Committee and be a tax measure than through the House Energy and Commerce Committee. The only exception to that, which is the big if, which is if the big three auto companies in the U.S., Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors decide that they want something on alternatively fueled vehicles to boost the market for such vehicles, then it is possible to conceive of Fred Upton from Western Michigan, who's the chair of the committee, going along with that. But that's a big if and a big possible. I don't think it's very likely. Did you want me to talk about the administrative jobs too, or no?
What was that? Sorry, Dan.
Do you want me to talk about who the possible replacements for some of the leading cabinet officials be?
Yeah, that would be great too. Obviously, it's been rumored that Secretary of Energy Chu and Administrator Jackson from EPA may be leaving, and who are some of the folks on the short list for potential replacements?
Well, for EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson, there are several people that have been mentioned. First, it's important to note that every EPA administrator under a Democratic president had first been a state regulator. And so it's likely that they will continue with that model, which suggests the following candidates. Many people think that for ease of succession's sake, they may just elevate the current Deputy Administrator, Bob Percisepi, to make him administrator. He had been both administrator of the water and air programs under Clinton, and before that was a regulator in Maryland. Another possibility would be the Assistant Administrator for Air, Gina McCarthy, who is distinct from Percisepi in two ways. One, she was appointed by Republican governors in Massachusetts and Connecticut to run their environmental agencies. And second, she's a woman in an administration that will be looking to have women in cabinet-level positions. Other people who have been mentioned include Mary Nichols, head of the California Air Resources Board, who has vast experience with climate change-related issues, and she also served as Assistant Administrator for Air under the first Clinton administration. Another possibility is Dan Estey of Connecticut, and he is also a possibility for Secretary of Energy. Other Secretary of Energy candidates include former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm, who of course would be very familiar with the need to invest in alternative fuels. She was a major advocate of getting money from the recovery package to invest in the advanced battery research and manufacturing in Michigan and other states. Other possibilities include Dan Estey, who I mentioned before. Another possibility is soon-to-be former Washington State Governor Christine Gregoire, who has vast experience in overseeing the cleanup of the Hanford nuclear production site in Washington. It's important to note that the Department of Energy, about half its budget goes to the maintenance of our existing nuclear weapons and the cleanup from where we used to make nuclear weapons. So having someone with that portfolio is a real possibility. It's also possible that that the President picks either a Republican or a business person to be Secretary of Energy if Chu leaves. Oh, one other possibility is former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Next, I want to talk a little bit. Obviously, there's negotiations going on right now about the fiscal cliff that's dominating everything here in Washington. And one of the things that has been languishing have been the extension of a number of tax incentives for alternative fuels and vehicles that some expired at the end of last year and some are set to expire at the end of this month this year. And this question is, I'm going to throw it to Paul Kerkhoven to take a first crack at this. Are there any prospects of seeing these extension of these tax incentives as part of the package to deal with the fiscal cliff? And if not, what happens to the tax incentives?
Here we go. Thanks, Ken. all of it is, as you indicated, it's hypothetical, and nobody really knows anything. Every day you hear a different rumor, and you hear another possible rumor. But there is definite possibility that some of these tax extenders will and can be part of fiscal cliff discussions. Whether it's going to be in one big fiscal cliff bill or there's going to be an associated tax extenders bill with it, all the members of Congress know that some of these, which extenders expired, which ones, how much money they raise. We bring it up every year. We've done it every year. And but you know, it includes other issues like R&D and then extensions for or write-offs, you know, the credits for teachers that bring their home equipment in, you know, but besides the energy issues. But the insecurity, the unsureness of whether these credits are going to be extended for businesses is incredible. And some of them have been sitting now for 2 years with the possibility of having these credits being restored, particularly if the ones were, you know, they expired at the end of 2010. Is there a possibility of bringing them back in if they expired at the end of 2011? You know, for how long are you going to do it? Now, the Senate has moved, and the Senate Finance Committee, has moved. There's an important distinction here. And they have passed the tax extenders package. And so ultimately that may be part of negotiations with the House if the House does their own extenders legislation. But in all likelihood, I think it's going to be part of the fiscal cliff discussions. And I'll leave it at that, and my colleagues on the panel to either rebut or add or supplement. Or
Genevieve, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, sure. And Paul is absolutely right in couching this all in that this is all rumors. I was at a meet and greet for a new member of the Ways and Means Committee this morning, and he allowed us, even among his colleagues, nobody knows what's happening. But what is clear is that extenders is not top of mind for these people. You know, they have they're trying to work out the outlines of a larger deal, and then one that includes, you know, AMT patch and doc fix and some bigger issues as well. And if they can get some near-term deal that has a longer-term component, you know, that makes a down payment on a longer-term component, extenders could go along for the ride. But I think if they're in a wait-and-see mode.
And then to follow up on that, and maybe Phil Square from the Propane Gas Association can take the first crack at this. You know, obviously there's a desire to see these things extended, but there's also a lot of discussion about having broader tax reform. And you know, clearly one of the things that folks in the alternative fuels industry have been interested in is to, instead of having these incentives extended 1 year at a time, to have some certainty over a longer period of time for the incentives once they're in place, so that the market can actually respond to the incentives and investors have some certainty for the future. What do you think the prospects are, Phil, for seeing these issues discussed and moving forward in the context of more comprehensive tax reform?
Well, my personal view is that they're separate. Tax reform, you know, it's been 25 years since we've had a real big run at tax reform, at really changing the way that the tax code operates. And, you know, whether it's the entitlement programs or the budget deficit or the national debt or whatever, those are such macro issues and will take so long to develop and evolve as in a legislative way, that I see these tax extenders, frankly, and government programs to boost or buttress alternative fuel usage in the country as really pretty separate. They may go through the same committee. They may have a lot of the same people working on them. But I don't know that tax reform as such is going to be a vehicle for what otherwise would be fairly simple and straightforward legislation to achieve economic and environmental goals through the tax code for alternative fuels. So NPGA's policy is going to be to keep plugging and looking for independent action on the extenders, and I think it's the best option is to take the Senate package, the simplest action for the Hill, and for us in the private sector is to pick that Senate finance package up and say, look at how simple it would be to pass this, and why don't we just move on with it, and you won't hear from us for a little while. So it would make their job a lot easier, I think, if they just went that route, and then they could focus all their brains on the broader problems facing the country and tax reform without having the alternative fuels folks rattling around asking for the extenders again.
Great, thanks. This is a question for Genevieve. This comes from one of the folks in the audience. Any news on the Department of Energy initiative EV Everywhere Challenge? Obviously there have been a lot of proposals both from the administration and members of Congress on establishing pilot communities around the country to really roll out electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids in a serious way. Any news on where those are going and where they're likely to go in going forward?
Well, I think I have the White House is looking to, I think, roll out the EV Everywhere Challenge in the first part of this year. The exact details of it, I think, remain to be seen. All of us in the community provided comments about how to sort of distribute the work between research, development, and deployment efforts. I know that the Department of Energy is looking to and has has already sort of pre-rolled out a workplace charging challenge component to try and build voluntary employer participation in adding workplace charging options. But as not to be just depressingly repetitive, but what really will be in play is what are the kind of resources they have to roll it out with, and what is Congress going to be willing to provide in an appropriations context for it. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges for the community.
Great.
So the bottom line is I feel optimistic that they're going to roll out soon, but we are going to need to all work together to sort of make sure it gets the resources that it will need.
Right. Here's another question for the panel. Relates to school buses. This is from another audience member. The largest fleet of public transportation vehicles are school buses. They typically are locally funded and don't receive federal funding. Any thoughts on the potential strategy to tackle the job of getting these vehicles converted, particularly the old diesel buses? Phil, I'll give that to you because I know the propane industry is working a lot with the school bus industry.
That's right, and that's one of the real gold stars that I think we can point to in the way a transition to an alternative fuel future would go, and that's the school buses. We've seen great success with school districts in getting them to understand the benefits of, in our case, propane autogas buses. the manufacturers have really come to the table, and we've gone, we've acquired a pretty strong market share for school buses just in the last couple of years. And working with our checkoff program, the Propane Education and Research Council, we've been able to really move that ball forward. And I think, you know, one district tells two people, and they tell two people, and they tell two people, and you can really see it spreading. So in that sense, I really think it's one of the great success stories that we can point to show that alternative fuel vehicles are viable in terms of their performance and their safety and their acceptance to school districts and to the drivers and the parents who put their kids on them.
Any other thoughts, Genevieve or Paul, on school buses?
Paul, I just wanted to add on. I think Phil's program with the propane school buses really is phenomenal. I think what the audience also, or participants may want to know as well, is that DERA funding in the past has assisted school districts have used that money for converting and or putting traps on school buses and trying to diesel particulate traps on it. Now, the DERA funding is drying up and it's been reduced, but from previous years, and what it's going to be like in the next CR or in the next energy and water appropriations bill, we don't know yet, but that's a potential option here for it. Similarly, you know, in terms of natural gas, there are a lot of natural gas at school buses around as well.
And this is Phil again. If I can just add one more thing, I think it's important that the school bus example is one where we can show that alternative fuels as a category, it doesn't need to be something that's brand new or that is an odd new chemical or something like that. I mean, this is stuff, you know, propane and natural gas, for example, have been around in vehicles for decades. And it's just a matter of, you know, coming together and meeting the new regulatory requirements and showing people that our fuels are everywhere, and it doesn't take that much to turn them into real strong transportation options.
And I just would throw in a follow on Paul's point, in fact that in a completely, you know, in an era of fiscal constraints, there are a lot of alternative pathways that can, I think we can do a better job of moving existing federal resources to state and local efforts at clean fleets, whether they be school buses or you know, state and local fleets in the medium and heavy duty segment, and you know, through CMAQ programs, through the EPA retrofit programs, state energy programs, even for instance, if you all are following this, the U.S. Green Building Council, which has LEED standards that are voluntary certifications for sustainable buildings, recognizes clean school buses in part of awarding points for buildings getting these designations. So I think there's a lot of pathways we can use to help people adopt alternative fuels in school bus and other fleets.
That's great. Thank you. And for those, just to clarify, DERA is the Diesel Emission Reduction Grant Program that's run by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And so one of our efforts will be to help make sure that that funding is maintained in the future. We had a follow-up question for you, Genevieve, on the DOE workplace charging initiative. Mm-hmm. Is there any more that you can say on how you think that's going to be rolled out and what likely are going to be the components of that, if you know?
Gosh, I hope I'm not in trouble. I hope I didn't speak too soon. But I think they're planning on launching at the beginning of the year, and I don't have many more details about that, but I expect they'll be coming out soon.
All right. So the answer there is stay tuned for new information from DOE and others.
Yes, and don't tell them you heard it from me.
You can say you heard it on the TEP webinar.
There you go.
Transportation Energy Partners, we have our Energy Independence Summit coming up in April, and we'll have 200 plus people in town, Clean Cities Coalitions, and folks in the clean transportation industry, and we'll be up on the Hill for a day. Last year we had over 170 meetings on the Hill, and we hope to do even better this year. The panelists have advice on the most effective ways to carry our message, and also what do you think will be the key issues that we should be talking about at that time, and how can our group be most effective in carrying our message? Genevieve, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think, I'm sure Phil and Paul, and I think Dan had to leave, would all agree. So that, oh, you still here? Okay, would
yes,
agree. All right. So that the basic rules of doing an effective meeting on the Hill, right, is, be brief and say, who are you, what do you want, and why should they care about it? That's basically what you need to cover. And in the who are you, you tie yourself into their constituent base. Like, how does this serve their constituents, which always makes it more compelling. And why should they care is, I think going forward, it's going to be really important to be making an argument that these are investments in competitiveness, in business development, that there are economic benefits associated with these investments, and that the return on investment for the taxpayer is not only growing businesses locally and nationally, and then a sort of aggregate benefit of increased national security. And I think hammering home those messages will be important.
Yeah, this is Dan Weiss. One other thing I would emphasize that Genevieve just touched upon is that these investments will not only create jobs, hopefully the speakers will be able to talk about local jobs that will be created, but also that to make the case that we need to reduce oil use, not just foreign oil use, because the more dependent we are on oil, domestic or foreign, as a transportation fuel, the more our economy and families' budgets are at the mercy of high worldwide oil prices, which affects the price of oil and gasoline in the United States. And, a number of the fuels that you all work on, whether it's electricity or natural gas, I don't know about propane, but I presume it's the case, are significantly cheaper than gasoline or diesel fuel. And so making the case that investing in alternatives will help unhook us from the fate of worldwide oil prices, which you can remind the senator or representative or her staff that are set on a worldwide basis by a cartel, and that all of the domestic oil production in the world will not really affect gasoline prices in the United States.
This is Phil. I would say also don't wait until that summit in April. Congress gears up pretty soon, and I'd start reaching out to them before you actually call them up and say, hey, I'm going to be in Washington to get a meeting. Send the materials early on. Find out who the energy staffer or the energy security staffer is. Pick up the phone and give them a call. Say, hey, I'm who I am. I'm from the state. I'm from the district, and I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to send you some materials and get to know them in the couple months you have before you're actually going to be in town, so that when you do have a meeting to schedule, they know who you are, they know your name, they know what you're in to talk about, and you can maybe be closer to making the sale rather than just sort of starting the conversation. So I'd start sooner rather than later.
That's great advice, Phil. And one other thing to think about is when folks come to town in early April, it's possible that there could have been a couple big macro events going on. First, the continuing resolution that funds the government at the current level for the fiscal year 2013 expires on March 27th. So if there isn't some big macro deal on, taxes and spending, that could still be up in the air, and they may have just come through that process, or they may have done a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 week extension. So that could really be dominating the discussion. Second, if those issues are taken care, if that is taken care of, there may be, they might be either in the middle of the budget process or the beginning of the appropriations process, and both of which, particularly appropriations process, as Paul and Genevieve said earlier, have big implications for alternatively fueled vehicles.
Yeah, and I wanted to add in a couple things. I always like the local angle. We've always talked about that. Dan, you really raised that. But if you have an event between now and April or any time, invite the congressman and or his staffer. They all have local offices, and get him out to your event, and you can again make that connection that Phil was talking about. The people know who you are, what you do, where you're going for, and you're building up your reputation, and you're giving them your advice of what's important to you, and so they can see what you've produced and take the next step.
Great, all very good advice, and I want to reinforce the importance of that if you're coming to Washington, you shouldn't just view it as having a meeting one time, once a year when you're in Washington. The goal really to be effective with your members of Congress is to build a long-term relationship, and that involves all the things that folks are saying, which is reaching out to them throughout the year, sending them materials, inviting them to events, and meeting with them. It's oftentimes just as effective, if not more effective, to meet with them back home in the district where you are in your communities, and to involve your stakeholders. To go as a group can be very effective.
Yep.
So I'm going to let each member of the panel make a final comment on their make your prognostication of what's likely to happen over the next several months in terms of clean transportation. Give me your best prediction. Phil, you go first.
Well, I think that if it happens, we're going to have a lot of action in the next 2 or 3 weeks on this stuff, and then there's going to be a lot of backroom stuff afterwards as we get into the new Congress, and so then we'll see sort of a break in the action for, I don't know, 12 or 15 months even. So I think we're going to be successful with getting extenders by the end of this year, and then we're going to take a breath until the authorizing committees gear up for the following year.
Genevieve.
Yeah, actually, and I like that prediction very much. Just so you all know, and in case any of your members want it, EDTA with Paul and Phil's organization has sent letters to both Finance and Ways and Means joint letters supporting extension of the alternative fuel refueling credit. So if you want to have a copy of that in your arsenal of materials as you speak to members, it's something to keep in mind. But I agree. I feel optimistic. If they can get anything done on extenders, I feel will be in there. And there will be a retrenching that will go, I think, I'll use the beginning of the year to go back and define what's possible based on the new financial and partisan climate post-election. And I don't see any giant energy bills moving, but I think we'll have opportunities to defend and advance our priorities in the spending bills going forward, in the hearings that they'll be holding to lay the groundwork for the next transportation reauthorization bill. So I think there'll be opportunities to move forward on a lot of paths.
Great. Paul?
Yeah, my crystal ball is cloudy, but I think I concur very much with what Phil and Genevieve are saying. I'm also optimistic. I think they'll get something done on in an extender's bill. I just reiterate again, there has been precedent by Congress where some of these credits have been expired or have expired, and they've gone back to reinstate them retroactively. So whether that's going to play out still this year, or we're going to see some sequestration and then potentially a deal in January, I hope not, but that's a possibility. But I do think that this is something going on. Some things will go on there. Genevieve's point about other legislation and issues going on, yes, highway was very true. Highways need to be reauthorized at the end of this year. Ports need to be reauthorized, and Chairwoman Boxer already held a hearing on that, so that's a big potential legislation for lots of efforts. But an issue that we really haven't touched on, there are a lot of states have a lot of initiatives and they have a lot of fundings for a lot of programs, and I would encourage a lot of people to start looking at those actions as well, besides just the federal government.
Very good point. And the last word to Mr. Weiss.
My prediction is that the Patriots make the Super Bowl. Oh, no, that's the wrong kind of prediction. I believe that there will be a amped-up confrontation with Iran during the first part of next year, which will drive up oil prices and gasoline prices and create an opportunity for alternative fuel vehicles to make a very strong case about investments in them on both national security and economic grounds. And so those who are in those industries ought to be prepared for such an opportunity, because it'll be a short window when you will have the opportunity to make that case as oil goes over $100 a barrel and gasoline, hurdles towards $4 plus a gallon.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. The panelists were great. Great discussion, a lot of information. I want to thank everybody in the audience. Remind everybody to register for the Energy Independence Summit coming up in April. You can go to transportationenergypartners.org to register, and we'll look forward to seeing you in D.C. then. Thanks again to all of our panelists. You did a great job, and we will have another webinar towards the end of January. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.